And notwithstanding what you hear nowadays, we didn't lose money today on the $10 ticket that you bought that included the lunch as well as the audio tape and the other materials and stuff that puts this conference on. So the important point is that it's not the most expensive commodity in the world to serve up good beef. I couldn't help but be impressed with that presentation made by the gentleman, Mr. Wiley from Australia. The one thing I don't understand for the life of me is how in the world you can destroy good beefsteak with salsa sauce, mozzarella cheese, and olives. John Austin said they're getting rid of their dairy products at the same time over there, is what they're doing. This lady that's coming up next, Kathleen Kelly, is quite a lady. I never had a chance to shake hands with her, unlike some of the others, until this morning. But I've heard a lot about her over the years. At the age of 26, she was elected to the legislature in Colorado. After having successfully served, she then went to Harvard University, where she was on the faculty. She comes from many generations of livestock and grain producers in the state of Colorado. At one time, she doesn't like us talking about this, but she was a rodeo queen. We learned that she recently experienced some difficulty sorting out her heifer calves from her steer calves, which I'm sure she'll tell you about. Sometimes a pesky piece of hay can confuse all of us. Like many modern-day South Dakotans, her ancestors came from Europe. Her ancestors lived in Scotland and Ireland and Russian and Poland and Lithuania. This is truly an American lady. What we sought here, we found with her. And what she sought and found in her life has shaped her values and her speech with us here today. She's going to discuss with us supply and other scapegoats. Please join me in welcoming the Vice President of the Rocky Mountain Farmers Union in Colorado, Kathleen Kelly. Kathleen.
Thank you very much. Governor Janklow, thank you. Bill, I understand, is what you prefer to be called. Yes. I know where that grass story came from. And boy, is my husband in trouble. He said, you know, Kathleen, I'm going to be there with you in spirit. And by golly, he sure was, right there in the introduction. So I can always tell when Reed Kelly's around. I got another story to tell, though, and John Wild, you're probably never going to forgive me for this. But 3 years ago, I was in Australia for the International Federation of Agricultural Producers. And I had just had a 30-hour flight transportation arrangement all the way into Melbourne. Got off the plane there and went to a Victorian Farmers Federation annual meeting. And we were sitting down to dinner. It was kind of an awards dinner, and I remember what we were having at that dinner because it was some kind of stuffed chicken thing, broccoli and cheese. And John Wild was saying something about, I'm not going to eat this. Give me that beef. Trying to find some way to convert the menu a little bit. And I had heard about John, and I was excited about the potential and the possibility of meeting this guy. I mean, gosh, we could talk cows. And even though I was suffering from severe jet lag, I thought, what a great opportunity this is going to be. And I sit down at the dinner table, and John's there at the same dinner table, and he says, do you carry a gun? And I don't know if you even remember this, John, but golly, I thought, okay, I'm in a foreign country. I'm not exactly sure what carry a gun means in the Australian language. And every place else I'd ever been for IFAP, I'd at least been given an interpreter. But they didn't think I needed one for Australia. So I'm looking at the woman who's my hostess saying, Ann, tell me, what does carry a gun mean? And she said, well, you know, a pistol or a rifle. And I got it. They really mean, do you carry a gun? Well, at that point, people started gathering around, looking over my shoulder, saying, tell us about guns, you know, tell us about guns. I want to talk cattle. These guys are going, tell us about guns. And so finally I said, well, yeah, okay, I own a gun. John goes, well, how many? I'm going, well, a couple. My husband has 3 or 4. My dad has 2 or 3. And he goes, my God, you got an arsenal. Well, by then I think everybody thought I was some kind of pistol-packing mama. And every time after that, that set the tone for my whole visit to Australia. And every place I'd go, Ann Adams, my hostess, would introduce me as, this is Kathleen Kelly. She has guns. Not she has cattle, but she has guns. And at one point, I was staying with Donald McGecky, who's the president of the National Farmers Federation in Australia. My reputation had preceded me even into his household. And we were sitting there in the family room, and in comes his 12-year-old son visiting for a brief time from boarding school. And his son walks up to me, and he says, Mrs. Kelly, we've got a serious problem with wombats here. Could you teach me how to shoot? I figured at that point, hey, if you've got the reputation, you might as well live up to it. Well, you'll be glad to know that while I didn't come here today with any guns, that I did come here with an arsenal of data. And it's data that I, as a producer, and I think many of you who are producers out here, understand and can relate to. Everything that I've collected comes from USDA and the Economic Research Service branches of USDA, from the Labor Department and the price indexes and all the data that it takes to really accumulate, look at what is happening in our economy as a whole and what that economic picture means. When I was in Australia, it was in the midst of what I call, as a producer, the crash in cattle prices here in the United States. I call it a crash. I guess it depends on which end of the cattle industry you're on. If you're a producer, it was a crash. If you were a broker, it was a market adjustment. If you were IBP, Cargill, or ConAgra, it was profit-taking time. Whatever you call that downward slide towards oblivion, to a lot of us it hurts. Most recent figures from USDA says that farm debt rose $4 billion in 1995, bringing total farm debt to $151 billion, the most since 1986. As we close out 1996, farm debt will rise another $4 billion. The majority of debt expansion is associated with a large increase in non-real estate loans. In other words, we're having to borrow more money just to survive. So here's the first bullet in that arsenal of data. For a long time, there's been a tendency for industry analysts to blame producers for the current market conditions. Their analysis settled on 2 key areas: supply and demand and price determination. The first argument concerning supply was that we are producing too many cattle. USDA figures were showing in all cattle numbers that we were inching towards 103 million head, today 104 million head. All cattle numbers include both beef and dairy, heifers, steers, and calves. Domestic cow numbers were at 31.5 million head. The second argument focused on demand. The contention was that per capita consumption had dropped from 79.2 pounds in 1985 to 67 pounds in 1995. Well, fine. So cattle numbers are up, per capita consumption is down. Are they price pressure indicators in and of them by themselves? No, they're not. In fact, one of the most intriguing things I learned when in Australia was that a market analyst whose job it was to study U.S. agricultural markets said that American markets are extremely price-driven, more so than any of the other G7 nations. She said if you saw a jump in per capita consumption of a product, chances were that the price of that product was at, shall we say, a palatable level for consumers. She said, and this is a direct quote, "We love the American market for one reason. We can dump all kinds of garbage there, things we can't get any other consumers in the world to take, so long as the price is low." My point is this: there are many factors which drive per capita consumption. One of the most important is the price the consumer pays for the product. If the price is too high relative to other competing products, then consumption of the higher priced product will drop. Think about this. We'll come back to it later. My bottom line question, which neither argument of cattle numbers and per capita consumption answered, was this: what is total beef consumption, versus total beef production in the United States? Now, in order to properly evaluate the veracity of a simple addition or a subtraction problem, it's necessary to look what's on the other side of the equal sign. I got a C in math more than once not doing that. So late one night last March, while I was patiently waiting for a heifer to calve, I began to enter USDA ERS data into a Lotus program in my computer. I had a sense as I was entering data that I had a surprise waiting. When I hit enter, I watched a line of red numbers flash at me and have never felt more angry in my entire life than I felt at that moment. It's the kind of white-hot anger you feel when you just discovered you've been living a lie. The gray block is consumption, or excuse me, I've got this totally switched. The gray block is production. The black block is consumption. In other words, in 1995, we produced 900 billion pounds under what American consumers consumed. According to USDA's Economic Research Service in 1994, when we began the great decline in beef prices, this is where we stood. Now, this chart runs from 1940 through 1994. Only one time in our history have we produced more than we consumed. That was in 1950. While the export of beef is being promoted in this nation, we don't even meet current consumer demand in our own nation. Now, I want you to think about this. Overall consumer demand, overall, not per capita consumption, overall consumer demand continues to rise. Why? Since 1976, we have added over 50 million people to the U.S. population. According to the Census Bureau, just in immigrant population alone, we are adding over 800,000 people a year to U.S. rolls. 1/4 of that population is legal immigration entering California, many coming from China and the Pacific Rim. At 264 million people, The United States is the third most populous country in the world behind China and India, with one of the highest growth rates. If Census Bureau projections hold, by the year 2000 we'll be at 276 million, and by the year 2010 we'll be at 300 million people, an additional 36 million from today and rising. These are only moderate projections. There's three levels of projections that the U.S. Census Bureau uses: low, moderate, and high. I've used the moderate projections because in the last 20 years those tend to be the trends that we're following. High side projection shows an additional 20 million people. So let's, for a moment, focus on moderate projections. What does this mean? Think of it this way. It's like adding another brand new state the size of, or states, the size of Tennessee, Georgia, Florida, Alabama, Louisiana, Kentucky, Mississippi, and that still ain't enough. Just for fun, let's try the high side projection. That additional 20 million people I mentioned earlier. Take the entire southeastern United States, then add it to New York City and Pierce, South Dakota. I knew you'd appreciate the importance of being linked to New York. And you've got the equivalent population increase. 320 million people total in the United States. At current consumption levels, low side projection of 67 pounds per person, we will need to produce, moderate projection, understand I'm not inflating these figures at all, an additional 2.4 billion pounds of beef. Boost the figures to the high side population projection and we'll need another 3.7 billion pounds. Beef eaters. In fact, we saw the sharpest rise in overall beef consumption from 1993 to 1994 that we've ever seen since the decade of the 70s, jumping 1.2 billion pounds. It's one thing to be concerned about the decline in per capita consumption of beef. As beef producers, it is incumbent on every one of us to seriously analyze the causes of these declines. But it is an entirely different matter to generalize per capita consumption to overall consumption and imply it's an overall decline. It's wrong. Many market analysts have argued that producers must lower production for the price of beef. Boy, that was a good sandwich. To increase as though supply were only factor to consider. They point vigorous blame at producers and blame us for the mythical oversupply. They point away from NAFTA, they point away from GATT, and they ignore the increasing concentration of ownership and control of the packing industry. Let me give you something to think about. Let's say we hold domestic production at current levels of 23 billion pounds for the next 15 years. Now that's just domestic production. That's where we're at today. That doesn't include imports. Using only moderate population projections by the year 2010, we will be short 3.3 billion pounds of beef in our own domestic market. That is a 14.4% increase in projected domestic consumption. That's overall consumption. I want to know, where do we have a supply problem? I don't see it. I wasn't the only one asking that question. A 4-H club in Rio Blanco County recently put together a survey. This was last winter, and it was in the heart of the winter when everybody has all sorts of things to think about. And it was an open-ended survey. The questions that they asked of the stock producers, of the Rio Blanco County stock growers, were things like, what do you think is the cause of the price decline in beef? What kind of effect do you think trade agreements have had on the price in beef? Of the 100 people surveyed, 99 respondents said the reason for the overall decline in the price of beef was market concentration and trade agreements coupled together. Remember there were 100? I bet you're wondering who the holdout was. It was the local banker. I had a whole lot of reasons I could tell you as to why that was the case, but I think you understand what that was. Most of these kids watch their parents lean across the table, shake a finger at them, and say, "Get your grades up, because you haven't got a future in agriculture anymore." Most of them saw the kind of price pressure that their parents were under, knowing that they were going to be going off to colleges. Colleges that instead of literally teaching these kids to create jobs, were merely teaching kids to get jobs. There's a huge difference in that. What those kids learned in the course of their survey is that they weren't alone. They learned that this is a problem that was through the entire cattle industry in the area that they were part of. And they learned that all their dreams and all the hopes and aspirations that they had were all tied together. They weren't just individuals anymore. Almost all people that were in that survey were cow-calf producers. And you might wonder why so many people believed exactly the same thing. And for a minute, I want to talk to those of you who are not cow-calf producers, because there is a little different attitude, a little different mindset here. People that are cow-calf producers are kind of a different breed of cat. Most cattle producers, particularly bull breeders, are detail people. And you'll know what I mean. You know, the little book that goes in the pocket that has the cow number on it and all the details related to that. They like numbers. They want to know pelvic measurements of a heifer, scrotal circumference of a bull, average birth weight of a calf. They even have height and weight measurements in their houses for their children. You guys know what I'm talking about. They measure, weigh, sort, calculate everything, because it can mean the difference between profit and loss. They may not have economics degrees that they've earned out of colleges and universities, but you can bet they've got an economics degree that they've earned out of the free market system. The king of the numbers crunchers of this breed of cat that I'm talking about is Leo McDonald of the Midland Bull Test in Montana. Leo and I talk quite a bit. We use a lot of the same data resources out of USDA and the Economic Research Service. And Leo likes to project a particular graph here and sit back and say, any questions? The little gray things that kind of, you know, are the height of the outhouse in the back 40, those are our exports. The big tall things that are a whole lot like the Empire State Building, those are our imports. The figures that you've seen up to this point in time have been beef imports, and there's a huge difference between beef imports and live cattle imports. Beef imports are chilled and frozen box beef that are coming across the border. But the numbers that have not been discussed up to this point in time are live numbers. What's crossing the border in terms of live cattle? I think that this illustrates that while we're off trying to ratchet open the market in Europe and cram our foot through the Asian door, we left our own door unlocked. The real so-called world market is right here at home. In a lot of respects, I think it's the reason why John Wilde is here. Australia is already through the Asian door. They want to be here too. They like the stability of our currency and the long-term potential of our markets. We have the best market in the world for beef. It is so good, in fact, we are the largest importers of beef in the world. We have such a terrific market. Look at what the Canadians think of it. Since the passage of the Canadian Free Trade Agreement, we have jumped from an average of 450,000 head of cattle a year from 1978 to 1989 to 904,000 in 1990. Now listen to this string of figures. 1.3 million in 92. Do you recognize the passage of a trade agreement there? 1.2 million in 93, 1 million in 94, 1.13 million in 95. Projections from USDA statisticians show that in 1996, it will be our largest import year from Canada ever, and may reach conservatively 1.5 million head. That's close to a 50% increase in 1 year. Think of what this 1.5 million head increase in production could have done for our rural economy if it had belonged to U.S. producers. At a recent Colorado Cattlemen's Marketing Committee meeting in Colorado Springs, our state statistician reported trends of Canadian imports into Colorado. In 1996, we began breaking all sorts of import records. In previous years, since 1989, we had averaged close to 9,000 head a month in our state. This year, the average over the summer jumped to 17,000. These are cattle bound for slaughter. But in October, new figures slammed into the data banks at 27,000 head of Canadian cattle, or 14.2% of all beef cattle slaughtered in Colorado. It's Canadian cattle only. In letter number 25 from USDA's Livestock Marketing Information Center, published this last June, the researcher analyzed the effects of import on supply projections. And John, this is where on the production projections that you were showing, that there is some distortion in the data. And it's a distortion relative to what has happened in some of the numbers crunching involving the inclusion of imports as part of our own domestic production. Even the graphs that we were able to see here earlier, starting the whole program, only showed beef imports, did not show the live imports. Well, the live imports themselves are then added on top of U.S. beef production, on live cattle production, and then those figures are then crunched to show what U.S. production per cow is. There is no question, even though total cattle inventory is 30 million head below 1975, that overall carcass weights, according to statistical sheets, are up dramatically. We know that. It's part of the production element of the industry. 14.4% for steers and 23.2% for heifers, while production per cow has increased 30.8%. But how real are those figures? Many people may not realize that USDA production number for beef is defined as the product of cattle slaughtered and weight. It includes all cattle slaughtered in the United States, regardless of where they came from. This is from the USDA letter number 25. In other words, it includes beef from imported feeder and fed cattle. Let me read a little to you from this newsletter. Beef production per cow has often been used to imply productivity of the nation's beef industry. The impact of cattle imports on this measure may be significant. Dividing beef production that includes imported cattle by the number of cows significantly overstates domestic beef production per cow. It may overstate perceived efficiency gains of the U.S. cow herd. Now, as far as I'm concerned, it was wrong for USDA ever to include import figures in U.S. beef production, And it was especially wrong to imply that those import figures related to our overall production gains. But that's what happened. Prior to 1985, imports were negligible enough that the inclusion of imported live cattle in production figures was relatively insignificant. It was 1%. From 65 to 85, we averaged 900,000 head of imported cattle. From 86 through 95, imports more than doubled, jumping to slightly under 2 million head overall. In 1975, almost 1% of U.S. beef production came from those imported cattle. In 95, it was 7.9%. This does not include the processed beef imports. And if you add on to it live cattle, processed beef imports, according to researchers from the University of Montana using conversion weights, converting these to billions of pounds and comparing them into the relative production scale in the industry, the figure is closer to 17%. What is the bottom line in this production equation? Instead of the standard 30% beef production per cow increases previously reported by USDA, a more accurate domestic production figure shows cow production only increased by 23 to 22%, most of the gains occurring from 1975 through 1986. From 1975 to 86, it's easy to point out that producers and say, yes, you as producers are to blame for that production increase. Greater efficiency gains, use of hormones, number of other things in that factor. But what about from 86 to present in this so-called edge of the cattle cycle? From 1986 to 1995, beef production per beef cow increased by only 1.4%. In fact, in 1995, domestic beef available to the consumer after export numbers are removed shows 1.18 billion pounds less than in 1985, or at 21.37 billion pounds. In 1985, the consumer had 22.5 billion pounds of domestically produced beef at their fingertips. You know, a lot of folks like to rant and rave about losing market share to chicken and pork. We just lost 17% of our beef market share to beef, foreign beef. Yet producers and their cattle supplies have been frequently chastised as the only culprits in the price decline. It is a deceptive admonition, diverting attention from what may be the real reason for the decline in the price of beef. Here's an example. USDA has an ongoing data spreadsheet showing everything in the price of choice beef from consumer to producer. There are several data lines in the graph if you run the entire table as a whole, but I use the only two lines through the hard raw data, the consumer to producer price spread. The top line illustrated in this graph is the price to the consumer. The bottom is the price to the producer. In 1978, when all cattle numbers were at an all-time high, 132 million head, producers received 63% of the choice beef dollar. The producer share dropped to 55% in 86, recovered somewhat in 90 to 60%, and then plummeted to the most recent reported producer share at 44%. Some would argue that these figures relate to choice beef only and not a fair overall market share analysis. Fine. Okay. Let's take a look at the opposite end of the spectrum. A look at hamburger. XL is currently paying 56 cents dressed weight for cull cows and bulls. The over-the-counter cost for ground beef at our local grocery store is $1.89 on special. That equates to a producer share of 30%. Tragically, one of the most misleading statements this year relating to consumer-producer price spreads and that ultimately shrugged off producer concerns came from the USDA Advisory Committee on Market Concentration in their June report. On page 4 of their report to the Secretary, they state, according to ERS, the relationship between net farm value and choice retail price since October '94 does not appear to be statistically different than a relationship that existed from '79 to the fall of '94. The committee gave the public the impression that net farm value was the value of live cattle, and therefore it was no real discernible problem. Net farm value, however, has little to do with the price of cattle. It has everything to do with land values. So in other words, the advisory committee comparing the rising value of ranch land, in my area that's Vail, Aspen, and Steamboat Springs, to the price of beef to the consumer. Had they been honest, they would have contrasted the dressed weight price to the consumer price. Apples and apples. What a concept. They didn't. They let you believe that there was no data to support concerns of a widening price spread, even though it existed in this chart, in the very data tables they were using. In all of the committee's analysis of the problem, did they not once attempt to address the increasing problems relative to the bargaining power of an industry so concentrated, one company alone controls 38% of the market, and its next nearest competitors each control a respective 20 and 21% of the market? The battle we're in today isn't just about the price that we receive for our livestock or the number of cattle we raise. It's far deeper than that, extending to the heart of democracy itself. This is the ultimate war. This is the fight for our free enterprise system. It is ironic that we have spent billions of dollars to try and wrench people from the world free of concentrated economic systems, like Russia and China, when in our hypocrisy we watch our own markets deteriorate into similar inflexible dictatorships. Since 1980, through mergers and hostile takeovers, we have watched our economic system shift from competition to predation. If there is a supply problem at all, it isn't in cattle. It's in the number of buyers we have for cattle. Now, some would argue that the multitude of consumers drive the market, but in reality of cattle production today, it isn't the New York or Los Angeles consumer who sits in the local auction barn. It isn't the consumer who walks into the feed yards to dictate price. And it doesn't matter if we have an export market or not. It's still the same buyer for both. It's a farce to call a market of less than 4 buyers in a nation of 264 million consumers competitive. It is nothing less than predatory. And the new predatory complexion of this market is not just a function of a few buyers. It is also the result of a few buyers holding a powerful tool capable of driving prices, captive supplies. The captive supply relates to more than domestic cattle under contract. It is also cattle imports. Both are similar to marked cards in a stacked deck. Played judiciously, such cards are capable of destroying the cash cattle market in a matter of hours. It doesn't matter whether the number of cattle is 104 million head or 140,000. If a buyer holds a significant percentage of those cattle under contract and slaughters only those cattle under contract, laying completely out of the cash market for several weeks, then the cash price will fall. There is no set price for formula cattle, and as the cash market falls, so does the formula price. The lack of price reporting has also served a role in pressuring down prices. The psychology of blind numbers keeps any potential bargaining power out of the hands of producers. The fact that USDA recommended only voluntary reporting of cattle sales is reflective of their lack of desire to enforce the law. Why is this fight that we're in so vital? Why do so many of us see this as the fight for our lives? It speaks to the very foundation of democracy itself. Choices, self-determination, individual and collective responsibility are all part of that equation. I don't want anybody who processes my product to tell me what kind of genetics to put into my cattle. And I'm not going to take their word for what they say the consumer wants. I want it from the consumer, and I want the flexibility to then do what it takes to meet consumer needs. All the laws under our Constitution protecting individual freedoms mean nothing if our economy has lost its flexibility, diversity, and opportunity. Democracy itself is lost when economic transactions can and do supersede constitutional rights. We fought with vehemence communism, fascism, and dictatorships for profound moral reasons. Democracy cannot survive a concentrated economy. We dismantled the great business cartels of Germany and the zaibatsu of Japan after World War II because we wisely recognized that the seeds of individual freedom cannot grow in an inflexible economy. We created antitrust laws not on theory, but on the harsh reality of experience, finally recognizing that our own system is vulnerable without proper, active management. Antitrust laws like the Sherman and Clayton Acts, like Packers and Stockyards, are the only dividing line between democracy and corporate dictatorships. It is long past time that we called an end to the antiquated economic philosophies that have driven the United States and world agrarian economics the past 3 decades. Simplistic and unfounded notions that bigger is better or get big or get out drove 6 million farmers and ranchers out of business just since 1970. We managed the supply of farmers and ranchers under laissez-faire economics with far greater cutthroat efficiency than we ever managed the supply of grain. Here's an example. When I was a fellow at the Institute of Politics at Harvard University, one of our basic duties that we had to perform was every Wednesday night we had cocktail parties for dignitaries that were visiting the university. One such visiting dignitary was a man by the name of Charles Schultz, who was the chief of the Council on Economic Advisors for President Carter. And I got to the cocktail party late. Not much on those things at that point in time. And when I walked in there, Schultz walked over to me and he said, "What are you doing here?" He had this suspicious look on his face like I didn't belong at Harvard or something. And so I explained that I was there teaching a study group on the American farm crisis. Schultz said, "Farm crisis? We haven't got a farm crisis." He said, "What we've got in this country is a crisis in guts. We ought to be getting rid of 2/3 of these farmers." Schultz's outburst was a quick, hard lesson. Economists, by and large, do not want to be burdened by the complexity of an equation that factors in human values and human needs. Within days of Schultz's declaration, Lester Thoreau, a renowned MIT economist, announced that agricultural policies had been such a dismal failure that in order to save a decaying but necessary food system, all farm and ranch land should be shifted to public ownership. Purdue economists like Richard Ling and Earl Butz continued to insist that vertical integration through market concentration was not only the coming trend, it was the solution. Some solution, huh? Even leading agricultural organizations have clung to this misguided notion. Testifying at a June hearing of the Senate Ag Committee, George Swan, chairman of the dues division of the National Cattlemen's Beef Association, stated, current concentration levels now exceed levels that triggered regulatory action during the 1920s. He's absolutely right there. At the same time, the industry must remain pragmatic. Change in the beef industry is a reality. They all miss one critical point. You have to have dreams, vision, and passion to have a culture, a community, an economy thrive. You have to have a sense that someday the impossible will be possible. Without it, we die. Without it, we become nothing. I came here today for one reason. I believe at this moment in our history, we have a tremendous opportunity for change. This right here in Pierce, South Dakota is the crossroads. We can choose to be serfs, or we can choose to be free men and women. I've had it with people that gripe and moan and say, yeah, we got a problem. But there ain't nothing we can do about it. It's going to happen. All of it's going to happen like it's locked inside a crystal ball. Well, I want you to pick up a hammer and shatter that dang crystal ball. You know, what are these folks? Some new age kind of priests or something that build these medicine wheels and medicine circles and pray to some weird entity out there and say, yeah, it's going to happen. Well, not if you and I make changes to say that it's going to happen a different way. Just like Dr. Heffernan said, we can guide and direct change. And here's how we're going to do it. We're going to walk inside USDA and we're going to pester them until we finally get the action that we need, until we get an enforcement of the Packers and Stockyards Act. And if we don't get that enforcement, then by golly, it's way past time we sued USDA for non-enforcement of the law. Politically motivated committees and Band-Aid actions like voluntary price reporting just don't cut it. We will do everything in our power to strengthen existing law. That's absolutely essential. And we must have a congressional accounting for the lack of enforcement in antitrust laws within the Department of Justice. Why is it the only major agribusiness corporation brought to the table to account for price fixing and collusion was the one who gouged Tyson and Purdue? But we have a responsibility beyond the law and beyond antitrust enforcement. And that responsibility is to ourselves, our consumers, and our market within this democracy. We're going to recreate our market until consumers can look us in the face and know who we are, and like and trust what they see. Northern Plains Premium Beef, Rancher's Choice, and others like those are only just a beginning. We'll build more co-ops, but we're going to create an economic environment that not only helps co-ops survive, but also helps new economic development relative to new packing thrive too. It's more than just co-ops. And we're going to take our children by the hand and we're going to tell them the truth. We're going to tell them that it's tough. We've been telling that for a long time, that it's darn tough. But if they've got the vision and the courage and the rip-roaring tenacity of their parents and their grandparents, they will do more than survive. They will be the leaders in a thriving, exciting transformation of American enterprise. It will be one finally that we guide instead of one that guides us. And if those kids are really good, like we know they are, it will truly be free enterprise. Change is coming. You can help drive it or let it drive you. So I'm asking you to stand with us today and help us create a vision that will be both dynamic and powerful. A vision so alive, it'll thrive through the next millennium. Thank you.